Okay, so shifting gears just a little bit today as we move into what probably will be our last unit looking at the time in the semester here. And so we've been talking about neural networks and getting kind of an idea towards the end there with these spiking neural networks and spike timing dependent plasticity that you can have these interesting decentralized uh, computational phenomena which may or may not be necessary to explain things like cognition in natural systems that we might like to mimic as we're building these kind of bio-inspired systems for AI and optimization. And so the motivation for this section is, I mean, kind of coming off of that, is to thinking about these. If you think about these brains, they are so-called well, they're systems of small components that interact, I'll say I'm going to say local ways that we can understand, but produce, I'll say large scale patterns whose emergence, I'll put that in quotes too, we may not understand. And so, sometimes the neuroscientists like to refer to this as the hard, or maybe it's more the philosophers, the hard problem of consciousness is that you can understand how an individual neuron connects to another individual neuron, but then trying to explain the general feeling that you are aware of yourself and your environment and how to get from there to here or here to there is seems a little bit murky. And so these complex systems approaches have this general phenomena or this general feature of trying to connect things that we can understand at a small scale to things that we do not necessarily understand at the large scale. And I just want to, again, as a way to pivot off of what we've been talking with neural networks, is try to say that towards the end of that neural network stuff, we started talking about spiking neural networks, but just to motivate that there is so much more going on that we can understand at the small scale, but really have a hard time projecting out. I wanted to at least take a little bit of time to really talk about the details that neuromorphic engineers hope to add to future versions of artificial neurons that currently are not in there, but we know from medical experience, for example, are apparently very important. So we've been talking about neurons and synapses, and really there are multiple types of synapses. So this is so here I'm just going to say example of small scale mechanisms that interact to produce interesting large scale I'll say system level behavior. You have this so we have electrical synapses, and so we talked about the neuron. So neurons, we view them as having these synapses, which are either electrical or chemical. And although we haven't been very explicit about this, we've really been focusing on models that are based on kind of the chemical synapse. The electrical synapse is sort of once thought to be sort of how all these neurons worked, and then gradually things flipped over to sort of trying to understand the chemical synapse. So there's already these two types of synapses, and so so basically there's, in the case of electrical synapses, which I'm not going to focus that much about, two cells, so two neurons are close together. So they're, say, within 2.5, or I'll say 3.5 nanometers. And at this separation, then if there is electrical activity in one neuron, it can create, via crosstalk, these electromagnetic effects that stimulate electrical activity in the other neuron. And so you can get electrical activity from any part of any cell to any part of any other cell, from axon to axon, from dendrite to dendrite, from axon to dendrite. So generally, if two cells are close together, if they're sufficiently close together, then if there is electrical activity down one cell, then it can couple to electrical activity in another cell, and that creates a so-called electrical synapse. And electrical synapses do happen, and they're important, but we think that the dominant activity that we focus on is chemical synapses, which I'll talk about here. And I'm talking about this to just show you how much we've left out of our models, even in the spiking neural network models, that we're thinking that in future models of neuromorphic computation, we're going to have to include these things. And some of the complex systems approaches here may provide us insights into understanding how all of these things that we're leaving out might contribute to the global system level behaviors that we would like to emulate as we're building these computational systems of the future. And so these chemical synapses occur over a much larger scale of, I think something like 20 or 30, I'll say 20 nanometers. And so what does a chemical synapse look like? And so, so basically, we've talked about, this is where this axon and dendrite language comes from. And so we have an axon that is from the presynaptic neuron. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Which is also, you could also view as the upstream neuron. And that axon has a bunch of, chemicals on the inside of it, known as neurotransmitters. And so inside the axon, you have a store of neurotransmitters. And these are basically chemicals, hormones. They're like so a hormone is basically a chemical used to communicate information from one part of your body to another. And so you have, usually when we talk about hormones, we're thinking about things flowing in your bloodstream over long scales. So how does something in your stomach communicate to something in your head? Well, there might be a hormone that gets into your bloodstream that sends that long scale communication. At the short scale communication, there still are chemicals that do that. And when they are specialized to neurons, then we refer to them as called neurotransmitters. So there's just a bunch of this stuff that's inside the axon that at any particular time will get flooded out of the axon and into the synaptic cleft. And so there is another neuron that is nearby, again, within, say, 20 nanometers. And it has this dendrite. And in between them is the so-called synaptic cleft. And that's basically your 20 nanometer gap. And so you just got this gap here that there's sort of a loose association between these two neurons and this gap being held between them. And there are these things on the axon called transporters. And there are these things on the dendrite called receptors. And so what's going to happen is when you get you get an action, when there is when an action potential has been reached at one neuron, causing it to a spike to travel down the axon, so that you suddenly get a flood of electrical activity inside that neuron. And what it is going to do is it will cause its transporters to then open up and dump these neurotransmitters out into the synaptic cleft, where they just hang out. And so these neurotransmitters just hang out in this synaptic cleft. Now, they are going to periodically, by just a random chance, bump into these receptors. And so occasionally they will then bump into one of these receptors here. And when that happens, that generates electrical activity inside the dendrite. So that is what then causes, it's like it's a transduction from electrical to chemical back to electrical. So that's how we get the movement of a signal in one direction from the axon to the dendrite across the chemical synapse. And it's going to hang out there, stuck to that receptor, stimulating that receptor, but occasionally, eventually, just by thermal agitation, it's going to get pop off, and it's going to get released back into the cleft. And it's just going to float around in the cleft, and then it might get bumped into another receptor, and it'll stimulate that receptor for a while, and then it'll get, pop back into there. Eventually, what's going to happen is the activity at the axon, the electrical activity, is going to die down. And at that point, then the axon is going to suck in all of those neurotransmitters. It is going to reuptake them. So it brings them back in. It releases them out and it brings them back in. And that stops the chemical activity in this cleft. And so that's how these spikes, you can view them. Remember, we said these spikes are kind of like, you get a spike, you get an activity, you get this extra period here. And basically, while this spike is open, then you're flooding this, this intermediate area, this junction, I guess, with chemicals, and you're waiting for those chemicals to then get sucked back in. So already there's interesting dynamics there. So how long does it take for the chemicals to flood into this thing? How long does it take for them to get bound? What happens as you get more thermal agitation, causing them to then recycle back into the cleft? How long does it take for them to get reuptake? There's all of those dynamics that may or may not be important when thinking about computing with spikes. But that's just one level of it. There, it turns out that there are different neurotransmitters. So some of you may have heard of some of them before, like you may have heard of dopamine, and you may have heard of serotonin. And you might have heard of things like called SSRIs, which is a selective serotonin, that's serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And so there we see that reuptake right there. And so basically, there's chemical wiring between these neurons that where it's multiplexed, where there's different channels, so different wires for different neurotransmitters. So any particular neuron can have there's genes that code for like whatever 30 different neurotransmitters, and some neurons express some of them but not others. And then other neurons express a different set and not others. So each neuron has a different set of neurotransmitters that it may or may not express, and then get released into this synaptic cleft. And then you can so it's not just as simple as every neuron communicates with every other neuron in the same way. Even though physically it looks like two neurons have exactly the same thing between them, if this neuron is expressing a different set of neurotransmitters than this one, then thermodynamically the interaction between these two neurons may be totally different. And so this is like the basis of all of neuropharmacology. So, so people, you might, anybody might take me, our dogs, we might be prescribed to take, certain of these SSRIs, for example. What those drugs are doing is they are preventing neurotransmitters from being sucked back up into the axons that released them as quickly as they previously were. Because what can happen is you can have these kind of misfires where neurons that are supposed to flood a bunch of serotonin into the cleft and communicate information don't get enough serotonin in there, or they suck it up too quickly, and then you end up sort of getting a poor firing. So you might have had a lot of activity upstream to the synapse, and then downstream of the synapse it doesn't end up being communicated properly, and that creates an abnormality in the brain function. And so maybe at particular times of the day, someone is a little crankier than they're supposed to be. And that's because they're not getting this wiring that is supposed to be making a connection isn't making a connection. And so allowing these synapses to then fill and stay filled with these neurotransmitters for longer then completes that helps fix that. And what's interesting about this, something that we don't deal with in any of our artificial models, is that your brain releases its own neuromodulatory chemicals into itself. And so just like you externally can decide that you're going to take Prozac or something like that, your brain internally can tell your brain at different particular times to have the same effect of these like SSRIs. So your brain can tune its own neuropharmacology dynamically. So this is a feedback that we don't often think about. This is as if, imagine if you trained a neural network and it had a certain set of weights. And then there was another part of that neural network that then told another subset of the neural network to just dial up its weights, just multiply all its weights by 2 for the next hour. And so for the next hour, then whatever weights you trained it at were suddenly going to be a lot more sensitive. But then after that hour, they go back to their old weights. So this idea that you can dynamically change your weights on the fly and have that being controlled by the same neural network that has those weights is something that we are not currently exploiting, but we know is going on in your brain all the time. And so that's why, certain times you're going to be more willing to learn or more sensitive to things. Other times you're less sensitive because your brain is affecting all of the neurochemistry that's going on in this synapse. And that's, in some ways, it's kind of like an ant colony optimization. The beauty of stigmergy that came out of that was the fact that they laid down a chemical that would evaporate at a particular rate, and that was a consistent rate. And so if you then lay down the chemical faster than that rate, then the chemical would accumulate and that would attract more ants. If you laid down the chemical less fast, then it wouldn't attract ants, and then that chemical would end up evaporating and that memory would be lost. Well, these slow timescale dynamics with this chemistry is going on inside here, but you don't just have one pheromone, you have like 30 hormones. So there's, hormones are kind of like the pheromones of the inside of the body, and you have the ability to tune each one of those together. So there's a lot here that even though we're finally getting into spiking neural networks, we simply do not have the neural vocabulary that real neurons do, even with spikes. In order for us to get there, we're going to need to have spikes of different flavors. We're going to have a spike of flavor A, a spike of flavor B, a spike of flavor C. Different neurons are going to be sensitive to certain types of spikes, but not others, and so on and so forth. And then in the evolutionary process of generating these neural network topologies, like the NEAT that some of you are studying for your projects, then you have to decide what type of spike does this neuron be sensitive to? What type of spike should this neuron send? And how do we make all that work? So this is really, really complex. It's complex because we can look at an individual synapse, and we can go into extreme detail of understanding. We know exactly what chemicals are released in here. We know the thermodynamics of how quickly they're reuptake back into the neuron. We can look at, and we can really understand everything that's going on at the level of that synapse. But you put a couple of million of those synapses together, and we have no idea what's going on. And so there's no hope in building kind of purely bottom-up theoretical models at that scale. You almost need a multi-scale approach. And so that's kind of what we're going to get in today, is thinking of a new way of thinking about computation in this really large scale, when we're just trying to build models that even give us any insight into what's going on here. So before I transition totally out of neural networks then, and into sort of the moving more towards these complex systems models and interacting particle systems, are there any questions about these chemical synapses, that, how these neurons are actually working and what we're leaving out? And I'm not expecting you to come out of this knowing about all the neuropharmacology of how the brain works, but I'm just trying to get you to understand that that the communication, that two neurons talking to each other is just as rich as two ants talking to each other, laying different types of pheromone down on the ground. All right, cool. All right, so that's the basics of neurochemistry. Complex, easy to understand when it's only two neurons, almost impossible to understand when there's millions of neurons. And that's complexity right there. So, and so there's a bunch of other systems, large scale human systems can be just that complex. It might be easy to understand how two people get along with each other, but once you put them even in a group of 10 together, then you get totally different group dynamics. You swap out one person, you get a totally different group. How does that work? We don't quite understand that. And we don't understand how important that complexity is to getting the emergent phenomena. If you do really want a general purpose intelligence like the brain, and can it be built out of the neural networks of today, or do we need things that have kind of more richness in them in order to get these emergent level properties? So that's what I'm going to shift here toward that end. So now this section is focusing on the broad theme of so-called interacting particle systems, or IPS. And then I'm going to do a lot of kind of with focus on cellular automata. And that includes stochastic cellular automata, and maybe a hint of how you can use evolutionary algorithms to tune cellular automata. So these interacting particle systems is a field that comes out of stochastic processes. Which basically describe, if you have the common theme here is going to be a sort of a combination of stochastic processes and graphs. And so the idea is you have we'll say a graph of particles, where you can think of the edges of the graph are communication, between particles. And we're interested in studying the systems where each particle changes its state stochastically, and that includes, it degenerates also into deterministically. So when I say stochastically and then also deterministically, what I mean is we have some probability distribution that helps us explain this. So it changes its state stochastically based on state of those it is connected to. And so neural networks are going to fit into this as a special case of these. The elementary cellular automata that you may have heard from, like Stephen Wolfram's New Kind of Science book, is going to fit into these, and so on. So there's a question: what is a particle? What does it represent? I'm just using the term particle as an entity that can have state. And so in a neuron could be a particle where a neuron might be on or off. An individual might be have an opinion, and their opinion is either A, B, C, D. Like maybe there are 4 people in an election, and A is the one that they want to vote for, and B is something that somebody else wants to vote for, and so on. And so each particle can be influenced by the opinions of other particles around it, and that gives us these so-called interacting particle systems, or IPS. So let's, as a motivating example, let's dial back into much earlier in the course when we talked about genetic algorithms. And so remember that I anticipated that most people, when they came into the course, may have been familiar a little bit with evolution in terms of natural selection, but this idea of there being drift as being also a driver of evolution and being an important effect was something that I think in most cases is new to people. And so, or at least new to those that maybe don't come from a strictly biological background. And so, you know, this drift is an interesting stochastic process. And this is something we can model with one of these interacting particle systems. So let's consider a small population, for example. So this is a small population. And you can imagine that each one of these populations, you can say that individuals hold opinions. We'll say A, B, C, or D. And so an individual currently believes A, maybe another individual currently believes C, another one's D, and so on. So down here, this individual maybe is also a C individual. And so it'd be one thing if we said that these opinions had different fitness. It was better to hold opinion A than B. But in this case, we're just saying, well, let's assume that there are no fitness differences between opinions. So any 2 opinions have the same fitness, which means that it is, if we think about things in terms of generations, if you were in the previous generation, regardless, you'll be equally likely to be in the next generation, regardless of what your opinion is. And so then the question is, then if this moves to another small finite population, then what will the opinions be? And especially, does this eventually converge? So so can we describe the equilibrium distro of this process? And so I could say this here is, so you say, what is the process? Let's assume that every generation an individual we could say that each individual, well, I don't want to be too specific right now, but we can think of this as imagine a GA with no fitness differences. And so we've got, this is, pop size in, and we also have pop size in. So the population size doesn't change. So there is going to be a change in the distribution of opinions just by the fact that a genetic algorithm isn't going to produce exactly the same next population as the previous population, but there is going to be a relationship between the previous population and the next population. And so the question is, can we describe this, the equilibrium, this, and then we know that fixation is an equilibrium. So we know that if you started with all of one opinion, so if they all had the opinion A, then regardless of what the random reshuffling was, the next ones are all also going to have that opinion A. If they all started with B, they're all going to be in B forever. So we know that fixed points exist. We know that equilibria exist, but do we always hit them? So does one opinion or genotype always fixate? And a computer scientist might look at this and ask a question is, do you always reach consensus? So that'd be sort of the more computational way to say that is, do we always reach consensus? And so consensus is a type of distributed computation. We all start out with some opinion. After a certain number of steps, we all converge on the same opinion. We may not know what that opinion was ahead of time, but we've all converged on it, we all agree on it. And then now that we have that agreement, we can make use of that in maybe future computations. And so do we always come into agreement? Do we always come to consensus? And so how do we model this process? And so in the IPS literature, there is a particular model that is used to model this called the voter model. And so the voter model I don't know why I put an equal sign there. So in the voter model, we say that each site is an individual with a preference for one of a discrete, and I'll say finite, number of candidates, A, B, C, down to K. And so these are discrete opinions, and we're going to say that at next time step, an individual chooses with, I'll say an individual chooses with some probability to take the opinion of one of its neighbors at random. And so basically at one time step, I could choose just to keep my opinion. But I could say, actually, I'm going to sample randomly from my neighbors, and I'll define what that means in a second. So there's a set of other individuals that I'm focusing on, and I'm just going to blindly take their opinion instead. I'm not comparing them. Just if I was used to be allied with opinion C, and I see my neighbor is allied with opinion A, then I'm just going to take on opinion A. And so we assume that so these neighborhoods can be represented as a graph, and so these neighborhoods together are, and I'll use the term irreducible, which just means that that one individual can influence any other individual given enough time steps. So topologically, it just means that there is a single connected component, so that that even though you might not be connected to everyone, they might not be connected to everyone. But if you, but there is a path from any individual to any other individual through this opinion network. And they said, is the opinion a scalar value? Yeah, you can view the opinion as a scalar value in the voter model. It's just, these are the opinions up here, A, B, C, all the way up through, say, K. So there's just a finite, there's a countable and finite number of opinions that you could take. You can enumerate them and say, I have opinion 1, you have opinion 2, she has opinion 1, he has opinion 3, and so on. And so you then just either keep your opinion or you take the opinion of someone else's. All right. And so all of these particles are sitting in on a lattice. And so so particles sit on sites that come from the space, the d-dimensional space of integers. So the idea being that these paths are, I see another question here, the paths are not unique, right? So opinions can get reinforced. So I don't know what you might mean by reinforced. It's just meaning that, you know, if there was an individual here and that individual is connected to some other individuals, and so I mean, it is possible for, I guess, maybe recurrent. You could definitely. I'm not saying that there's any constraints on whether things get. Like there could be another individual out here, and so there's technically a, you know, it doesn't have to form a tree or anything like that. All we're saying is that any other individual there is a path from any individual to any other individual. That's what we mean by it being irreducible. All right, so the particles sit on the lattice of integers. And so you can imagine these multiple dimensions. So this is the d equals 1 dimension. And so we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we've got the d equals 2 dimension here, and that's also got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so, of course, you could fill in, you could cross all of these. So there's all these different points. And then you could go out to d equals 3, and there's 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so, and then I guess I should draw this, you know, it's also going back in the other direction. So there's -1, -2, and so on. It's going in this direction, it's going in this direction. So it's just the lattice of d dimensions, and that are each integer valued. Okay. So, and yeah, there's, this fits, by the way, there's some questions about the spread, models of the spread of religion and things like that. So this fits within a much larger literature of opinion dynamics that include these type of kind of discrete dynamics as well as more kind of ODE forms. And so there's a bunch of models for how opinions diffuse through a population. And this is one of them. And so you could imagine just what would happen if a population just randomly, you bump into someone and you take their opinion with some probability, then what would you expect to happen to the whole population over time? And an opinion, you can bump into someone and not take their opinion and keep your own opinion. But in this model, you can't spontaneously choose an opinion that is not existing in your neighborhood. So the only opinions available to you are your current opinion and the opinions of everyone you're connected to. So everyone has a list of neighbors, and those are the ones that you can choose your random opinions from. All right. And so there are then these questions of so if we have everybody on this, and again, so every neighbor, so if I was to focus on a particular individual, then that individual's got neighbors that may be, they could be everywhere. So I've got the blue individual and I've got their neighbors, and their neighbors are all over this space, this lattice. So they might just be in the plane or they might be out of the plane and so on and so forth. And so the question we have is, so this right now is an infinite set of individuals. So this is, in this model, we're assuming an infinite population . And just for simplicity, we're assuming an infinite population. And then the question is, do they come to consensus on one opinion? And does the dimension matter? Because you might think that if you can solve this problem on a line and you can solve this problem on a plane, you certainly can solve it in a cube. So if you come to consensus on a line and then you just redraw your neighborhoods, so now that your neighborhoods are, you've got a planar population and you've just redrawn your neighborhoods there, then certainly then if it works on a line and a plane, if you go to a cube and you just redraw your neighborhood so everybody's on a cube, then maybe you should still get consensus in the cube. And so the question is, can we have a mathematical, can we solve this mathematically? Can we sort of try to understand whether under what conditions do we get consensus, and how does the dimension of the sites that everyone is on affect this? So that's what we're trying to model. So the kind of macro scale property is, do we get consensus? We have these funny little micro scale dynamics, and we're going to use stochastic modeling to try to make better sense of it. So initially, if you try to think of this forward in time, so if you think about, you could say that, individual in the kind of forward time perspective, then you've got, individual, I and individual I plus 1 and so on, all of these individuals. And you could imagine that individual I has a particular opinion, and that opinion might shift, and that might shift again, it might shift back. And then you've got individual I has got its own opinions that are happening, but eventually they might, all of the individuals might converge on one opinion. And you could say, well, in the time forward perspective, maybe I'm going to model this as how many individuals have each of the opinions. So you might say that, well, okay, individual A, maybe there's two that at the current time, 2 have A, 1 have B, 3 have C, and 2 have D. But at the next time step, there's a switch so that maybe that 3 have A, 0 have B, and maybe 2 have C, and 3 have D. And this could go on until eventually you find that everybody's got A. So I have all 8 have got A. And at that point, this thing is fixed. And so this ends up being an absorbing state. Is basically A is equal to 8, and everybody else, B equals C equals D is equal to 0. That is an absorbing state, a fixed point of this system. And the problem with, and this is a Markov chain, so you could model the state of the world being all possible. So you could imagine that this right here is the state of a Markov chain. And this is a different state. And this is one particular absorbing state. But that would mean that there are 4 absorbing states in your Markov chain. And you would have to then say, how often do I hit any one of those? And is there a chance that, that somehow I'm not going to hit one of these absorbing states? Is there some other state in this system? So once you get absorbing states, then these become very difficult math problems to solve, because a lot of the tools that we've built for studying Markov chains are under the assumption that we do not have any of these absorbing states. So we would like to work with so-called ergodic Markov chains that that these are irreducible in that they, we would prefer. And these type of Markov chains, there's no one distinguished state that once you go into, you never come out of. Every state could still be visited later. And so at least there's always a possibility of getting from one state to another. That's where this irreducible comes from. And under these conditions, it becomes much easier to then deal with the math of these things, because you can kind of solve for a fixed point where things kind of come into balance. And it's this balance, this so-called detailed balance property, that allows us to work with these types of Markov chains and not the others. I'm not going to go into great detail on this. I'm just sort of saying that there is a mathematical theory that we can use, but we can't use it when there are these absorbing states, because we don't have this irreducibility. This other state is not ergodic, so it's just the wrong type for us to do this mathematical analysis. So what people who studied the voter model did is they said, in order to really understand consensus, we need a different way to look at this system. And so they said there is a dual model, which is the reverse time perspective. And so in this perspective, you basically think about where you try to formulate the system starting with consensus and then moving backward in time toward seeing where that consensus came from, or you sort of start at a time much later and then see how likely it is that everybody would still be holding a unique opinion. That's basically, it's focused less on following an opinion forward and more following the probability of unique opinions backward. And this ends up being a much more convenient Markov chain to work with. And so the idea here is, let's say that, so I've got this is a time reversed Markov chain or Markov process, where now I am going to basically I'm going to put, and this sounds crazy, but I'm going to start out with a separate Markov process on every single individual. And that separate Markov process represents where that individual got its opinion. And so for simplicity, I'm going to consider just a one-dimensional torus. So I'm considering individuals that live basically on a ring. So I've got my, let's say I've got, I think I drew that many individuals, but so individuals on a ring. And I am then going to take the individual ID and I'm going to put it on this axis here. So this is individual 0, and since she's on a ring, it'll also show up down here. So let me see if I can fit, say, 6 individuals here, just to match my notes. So 6 individuals on a torus. So this is a dimension 1, but instead of going in infinite dimensions, I'm just for simplicity wrapping it up so that once you hit individual 6, then next individual 6 goes right back to 0. So they're on a ring on the torus. And I can then keep track of where the individuals get their opinion at each time step as we move backward in time. So this is going to start at time t, and then I'll move to time t minus 1, and then I'll go to time t minus 2, and that process, t minus 3, will go on until eventually I hit, I march toward my initial conditions. And so this is the start of the process, and this is what I'm calling the end, or it's late, or where I've stopped the process. And so if I focus on individual 6, then what I'm plotting here is where individual 6 got her opinion. And so I'm going to say that at time step t, individual 6, that's her opinion. And then I'm going to say at t minus 1, she might have had the same opinion that she had at time t. And so I'm going to then show that thing stays together. At t minus 2, she might have also had that same opinion. So that was her opinion. But then at t minus 3, what I reveal as I go backward in time is that she used to have an opinion that was different than that. And at t minus 3, she adopted someone else's opinion. She took individual 5's opinion. And so at t minus 3, she ends up switching to individual 5's opinion. And now at this point, I could have done, so I say that's cheating, right? I see that. So the idea is I'm not keeping track of what individual 6's opinion is. I'm just keeping track of where she got it. And so this edge here marks that at t minus 2, individual 6 took previous opinion of individual 5. And so you could keep going all the way back. And then so you could do that for other individuals. So like individual 4, this is individual 4's final opinion. Again, it might be that individual 4 and 6 agree. We don't know. But I'm going to start a Markov process at individual 4 that is going to look backwards. It's going to, at the trajectory. And it turns out that if there was a Markov process going forward, it's also a Markov process going backward. And so I know it was a Markov process going forward, keeping track of the kind of accounting of where the opinions are going. And so I can also generate a Markov process taking that same trajectory, but generate it backward. And so the Markov process going backward for individual 4 might say that 4 kept its final opinion from time t minus 1 on, but at time t minus 2, individual 4 actually got her opinion from individual 2. And so at t minus 2, it takes individual 2's opinion and it jumps up to individual 4. So we're keeping track of where each individual got their opinion. And so these things can, so I can just draw a couple of these sort of sample trajectories. And so on. Now, I'm drawing these together because what's interesting is that whenever 2 of these, remember that these are separate Markov processes. So this is a Markov process that has been started on individual 6 in the future, moving backwards. This other one is a Markov process that's been started on individual 4, moving backwards. And this one has been started in individual 1, moving backwards. But at the point where I find that these backward moving Markov processes join, then at that point, I know that they're going to match forever forever moving in this direction, they are going to match. In other words, if I adopt individual 4's opinion, and if someone else adopts individual 4's opinion, then both of us are coupled to individual 4's trajectory. So so we both, you could say, well, where did individual 4 get the opinion? So like you could ask me, where did you get your opinion a minute ago? And I said, well, I got it from Joe a minute ago. Well, where did Joe get his opinion? Well, Joe got his opinion from Kelly a minute ago. And then I could say where Kelly got her opinion, and so on and so forth. If someone else's trajectory lands on Kelly at that same time point, then I don't need to do any more work because I've already done the work by tracing the other one through. So if I were to follow individual 1's opinion trajectory at the point where I hit this point and then figure out the provenance of that opinion, so I could view this as the kind of provenance of opinions. At the point where I've determined the provenance along one path, I've done all the work for the other path. And so, so the idea being that these 6 independent Markov chains, whenever they intersect, they coalesce, and then they become fewer Markov chains. So I could draw that on the other side here. I could say, well, let's just say that these come together back here, and then at that point, they draw out, they trace out something that looks like this. Or I guess I need that to line up with 0. Oh. There we go, 0. So the idea here is that this coalesces from 2 Markov chains to 1. So 2 go in and 1 comes out. And I see a question here, how do they intersect in the past and then separate in the future? So again, this is a bookkeeping approach. And so the idea is if you start your bookkeeping in the future and you walk backwards towards the past, then as you're sort of, for every individual, it's kind of like doing contact tracing. It's exactly contact tracing. So this is contact tracing of individuals. So, given that, we've got COVID-19, a lot of you have probably, seen these graphs where you've got like a patient 0, and a patient 0 infects these other patients, and then they infect others, and so on and so forth. And then, so if you end up catching someone here who has the disease and you want to figure out, well, where the heck did this disease come from to begin with? Then you start tracing their contacts back. And you say, well, this individual was intersected with this individual, and that individual talked to this individual, and that individual talked to this individual. And so we can see that the disease ultimately came from this individual down here. That's the source, our patient 0. And, but if I were to instead do contact tracing, starting from the individual up here, then I'd say, well, this individual talked to this other individual, and then this individual, oh, that individual found someone in our cluster. And so we know that the at that point, we just follow the provenance of that cluster. So we thought initially that we had two, the question was, are these two independent clusters of infection? And then when you do contact tracing, you see that no, they are not. That's the answer, is that they must not be, because they all come from the same. And so once they coalesce, they can't separate, because we're sort of saying that like, so how could it possibly separate? It's like if you're sick with a disease and you got sick from a disease from someone else, and someone else got sick from a disease from someone else, then at that point we know that we both got the disease from the same person. So there's no way that somehow in the future it would separate. At that point we just follow, we say, well, who did that person get the disease from? So once you know that you got your opinion from someone else and someone else got the opinion from that same person, we can forget our identities, because our identities become the person we got the opinion from. And we just need to see, where did that person get their opinion from? So this is just contact tracing of opinions. I see once they coalesce, not separate. So we can say well, we could say this whole approach is drift. And so the question is, does drift lead to fixation? Because the voter model is the voter model is a model of genetic drift. So the question was, when you had no fitness, how do you decide how do you decide what the population is going to look like in the next generation? And so what the mathematicians figured out is, they said, well, if we only have n spots available for the population, so there's n now and n later, then we can model that as saying that either you stay in the population or someone else takes your spot. And someone else takes your spot, it has to be someone in this population who takes your spot. And so with some probability, your spot in the next population is either going to be your genotype or someone else's genotype nearby. And so that's what the voter model is modeling, is that you're either keeping your opinion, meaning you're lucky enough to have been randomly selected to go into the next generation, or you were unlucky enough to be pushed out of the generation in which your spot was randomly taken by someone else who was in your generation. And that looks like you randomly choosing someone else in your generation and taking their opinion. So the voter model was meant to model evolution when you have these neutral solutions where all of the genotypes are neutral. They do not have any fitness advantage. So how do we model neutral evolution? People proposed the voter model was a nice conceptual model to understand how these systems work. And so it really becomes kind of this infection type model. And so that's this kind of contact tracing. So the beauty of it is that what was an infinite number of Markov chains that were moving along independently, every time they intersect each other, they coalesce. And our real question is, when we get back to time 0, how many Markov chains are left? If there's multiple Markov chains left at time 0, then that means we did not. So this here, since this is one Markov chain at time equals 0, that implies consensus was reached. And so, which another way to view that is, can we show that individuals randomly moving throughout this lattice are inevitably going to intersect everyone, or intersect someone who has intersect others? And so this is, you know, similar to sort of saying, is it possible for a disease to spread through a whole population? And so the question, how do we start the Markov chain at time t? Well, it turns out this process of, there's time reversibility of this process. And so the idea is that if you are a distributed process, so and you interact with another process and take their opinion. So if I were to draw that, I could say that you could say I have a process A. Maybe that's bad to call process A. I'm going to say I have process I that interacts with process J at some time t. At time t, and with some, there's a probability. Let's say there's a probability on process. There's a probability on process I that it will take process J's opinion, and so that probability is whatever 20%. And then there is also a probability on process J that J will take I's opinion. Let's say 40% or something like that. And so it turns out that modeling that this is time reversible, in that if I can model the forward probability as well as the backward probability from this description. So if we bump into each other, I can unroll this and also get a Markov chain description of this. And so I guess another way to view it is imagine, maybe it's easier to think of the two billiard balls or something like that. If I've got these two billiard balls and they come in and then they hit each other and then they bounce away from each other, and then there's a certain amount of energy here. So this has the energy of process I, the energy of process J, and then they hit each other and then they go off. And then there is some delta of the energy in process I and the energy in process J. Then I can calculate sort of, how much energy could have been exchanged in that. But I can also take the video and play it back the other way. And if I take the video and play it back the other way, it looks like the billiard balls are now moving in the opposite direction, intersecting here, and then moving off in the opposite direction. And they started with whatever energy they had here, and then they ended with whatever energy they had here. And both descriptions of the system are valid, the forward time and the reverse time. And then likewise, if I build a Markov chain that has this property where it only depends on the current state, then it's possible for me to generate a forward time Markov chain and a reverse time Markov chain. And they're both Markov chains. It doesn't matter if I'm playing them forward or backward. The statistics are going to be consistent. So what's kind of beautiful about this is that it's not like this is data driven. It's not like I generate a forward trajectory and then I have to then play it backwards. I say, no, I can generate a backward description in terms of backward probabilities and just generate a Markov chain that happens to be going in the reverse direction. And that Markov chain will have the right statistics. So I can model it like a forward Markov chain, and it will have the right statistics of a Markov chain that I did forward and then played backwards. So I don't actually have to do it forwards and play it backwards. I can just start backwards in time and I'll have the right probabilities. So that is a convenient tool that you can use for these types of systems, is to just, if you're ever having a problem modeling your system stochastically going in the forward direction, you can ask yourself, is there a way I can remodel this thing in the backward direction? And maybe that Markov chain is going to be simpler. And that's exactly what the interacting particle systems folks did when they came up with the first proofs to understand consensus in this. All right. So let me get to the punchline here. So the question was, like, okay, so this is my consensus condition. So really, do they reach consensus is equivalent to saying, are they all going to intersect with each other? Is there going to be a patient zero? Is it, or in other words, is it possible for one of these Markov chains to always avoid the other Markov chains? Because if it is possible for, say, Markov chain 6 over here to manage to constantly keep skirting the other Markov chains to maintain its identity so it never coalesces, then Markov chain 6 will have its own individuality back here at the final time. And then that will imply that there was not consensus. And so that it might happen to be that they have the same opinions here, but I can't guarantee it because I would need to know how they started out. And so the beauty of it is I don't have to actually ask any questions about multiple Markov chains. I can ask a question about one Markov chain. And that question about one Markov chain is it possible for one Markov chain to visit every point in the space? Like, or with what probability will a Markov chain revisit every point in the space? And so there is a theorem that you might have heard of that is Polios recurrence theorem, which there are other recurrence theorems in continuous time that mechanical engineers might be more familiar with too. But the Polios recurrence theorem basically says that for a dimension equals 1 or dimension equals 2 random walk, then you encounter every point with probability 1. But then for 3 dimensions or higher, then there is less than unity probability of visiting every point. So in other words, if you put yourself in a box and it has an entrance and you bounce around that box, then the question is, will you find the entrance? If the box is one-dimensional, if it's a line, you're going to find the entrance. It may take you a while, but you will find it with probability 1. If it's a two-dimensional box, it's a plane, you're bouncing around that plane, you will eventually find the entrance again. You'll get out of that box. At the point where you go to 3 dimensions, at the point where it is a cube or worse, if you're just randomly bouncing around in that box, there is some finite probability that you will never find the exit. You'll get stuck in the box. And yes, this is infinite time. So this is in infinite time. And so once you get to 3 dimensions or higher, you get stuck in the box forever. There is some finite probability, some non-zero probability that you will get stuck in the box forever. And the beauty of this applied to the consensus problem is that if you've put all of your particles on a 3-dimensional grid or higher, then what this tells you is that 3 dimensions or more, there is some probability you will not reach consensus. For 1 or 2 dimensions, you're guaranteed to reach consensus. And so in 3 dimensions, there's enough freedom for this opinion trading to happen. And there will be some cases with appreciable probability where individuals keep bumping into each other and they end up sort of sharing opinions, just missing each other, like trains passing in the night. And that trains passing in the night is going to prevent you from reaching consensus. And so it's a little bit mind-blowing the first time I kind of thought about this, that the topology of how you put distributed processes is going to affect whether they reach consensus, at least when there's an infinite number of them. And so this is, if you're designing, this may, if you're designing robots, and you talk about robots have to bump into each other to share information. Usually we think about robots driving around on a plane. This suggests that once you go to quad rotors, if you got fully actuated robots moving around in 3 space, algorithms that worked when they were driving around in a plane are going to fail to work once they're bumping into each other in 3 space, because there's kind of enough room that they can kind of, again, this train's passing in the night effect. And so that's kind of one of the examples of how we solve these interacting particle systems types problems. And I should probably stop there because it's 4:21. So let me do this, since there's a couple of questions in the chat. Those of you who need to go, you can feel free to hop off. I'll take a couple of questions in the chat here. And then we'll get, the next time we'll talk about elementary cellular automata, which are a little easier to wrap your head around, but also have some pretty beautiful patterns and computational results. So, all right, so if you need to leave, feel free. Otherwise, there's a couple of questions here. I see this. So can we use this as an excuse for not coming up with an optimal solution to a multi-objective function? Good question, actually. So the real question is, when you design stochastic search algorithms, you have to ask yourself, am I going to get stuck in one of these types of traps? And so can you use this as a conceptual model to think about whether you're going to reach the end of a computation and whether that computation is going to be meaningful? Sure. There's a question, are there projects where people have actually used this? I mean, people study consensus and agreement in a wide range of projects. And so this is used to study neutral evolution, as I was mentioning, that's in biology, but these also are used to study agreement and consensus in distributed processes and computer science as well. So yeah, this is like, I think the papers that you can find that first, published this theorem might have been in like 1982. So this is some pretty old, kind of well-known stuff. And then I see the probability of success is less than 1, but is it still high probability? Like, is the system of n, is the probability of leaving the cube something like, oh, so there's a question of the bounds. So this, in this generic model, I don't have like particular bounds, like as you make, so, and also this is, even though my model was on a torus with a finite number that are in a ring, the full model is in this infinite system where you have an infinite number of agents on an infinite integer lattice with a finite number of dimensions and a finite number of opinions. And so then the question might be is, well, what happens as the number of opinions gets higher? What happens as the number of opinions get lower? And you might be able to find results about that. Usually the interacting particle systems people don't have, like a computer scientist would view this very differently. Like, can I bound that probability? And over time, what happens to those bounds? But what this result would suggest is it would be impossible to bring it all the way down to 0, because you've got infinite time and you still have a finite probability. But you certainly can make this, a finite system, and it's totally going to change the dynamics. But for simplicity, it's just an infinite system here. All right, any other questions? Okay. All right, so in that case, I'm going to stop the recording.